All right. Well, welcome everyone. Welcome in person and online. Thanks for coming tonight. This is our first doctrinal class of the season, and this is a topic that I've been thinking about for years and wanting to do something with, and it seemed like now is the time. And so I wanted to talk about doctrine as spiritual food. I've worn my costume for tonight, my apron. Um, so yeah, let's go ahead and start the PowerPoint. Len. So doctrine as spiritual food. There are a lot of, I think, useful applications for this analogy, this symbolism, this correspondence, and I just want to kind of explore those tonight. And I think they're also especially fitting in the Lord's new church, as you'll see, because it has to do with how we understand the Third Testament, as well as the Old and New Testaments. So you're probably familiar with the general correspondences of food in the word often symbolizes goodness or love, and drink often symbolizes truth. Spiritual food is goodness, spiritual drink is truth. This is a pretty common symbolism that you run into in the Third Testament. And there's all sorts of ways that gets talked about. Food symbolizes heavenly goodness because angels have no other food than good that is done out of love and charity. Not only does it keep them alive, it refreshes them. So in the same way that food gives us energy and the ability to act, doing good things gives angels the energy that they need. And you think about the things, even in this world, the things that we get energized by, it's not always food. Sometimes it's doing useful things that we love gets us energized the way food energizes us. So it happens in this life too. And this gets talked about in the New Testament. It says he filled the hungry with good things. Jesus said to them, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work. Do not labor for the food which perishes, but for the food which endures to everlasting life, and so on. So Jesus was hinting at this on the earth when he was on the earth, that this is what real spiritual food is. And some of the main symbols we see this in are things like fruit, like the fruit from the tree of life. Fruit often has the symbolism of being fruitful, being useful. Fruit that serves as food symbolizes the good done by love. And this also gets talked about in the Old and New Testaments. You'll know them by their fruits and things like that. But then another common symbol is bread. Bread is often a symbol for goodness or love. Bread in the general sense, includes and means food of all kinds. And in a general sense, bread means good actions that come from love. So that symbolism of breaking bread is a symbol of sharing what we have with others. And that's a symbol for love. Give us this day our daily bread is not talking about physical, actual bread. It's talking about the things that nourish us, nourish our souls. And that's love. That's goodness and love. So then drink is often a symbol for truth. And we even think that way and talk that way, feeling like we're thirsty to know something. Spiritual drink is truth. There's that great story with the Lord, with the woman at the well, talking about not just this water coming from the well, but the water that I shall give them will become in them a fountain of water springing up into everlasting life, starting to get people to think about the idea that water is a symbol for truth, the truth that the Lord can offer us. And then, of course, you're probably familiar with the Holy Supper. Bread in the Holy Supper is a symbol for the Lord's divine love. Wine is a symbol for the Lord's divine truth. So I just kind of wanted to establish that a lot of the symbolism is focusing on that kind of thing in the word. But there is another way to think about things, and this comes up in certain contexts. And that is that at a celestial level, there's these different levels of things, the spiritual level, and the celestial level, which is higher. And on a celestial level, both food and drink symbolize goodness and love. And on a spiritual level, both food and drink symbolize truth. Heavenly food or celestial food is every benefit of love and charity received from the Lord. Spiritual food is every true tenet of faith. These two types of food are what an angel lives on. So what I want to do tonight is focus on that blue level, the spiritual food and drink representing truth or doctrine. And it's not disregarding the fact that there are other contexts, but tonight I want to focus on that one. Doctrine as spiritual food, or food as a symbol for doctrine. So here's some passages about that. Spiritual food is knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. These keep spirits and angels alive and nourish them. They desire and long for them in the same way starving people long for food. So appetite corresponds to that longing. Here's another one. Sustenance or food symbolizes inner truth. Feeding or eating stands for receiving instruction in truths and forms of good. And then a longing and desire to know truth correspond to appetite and flavor. And secular and religious knowledge correspond to food. Because they correspond, they also function the same way. And that's really what I want to focus on tonight. Because these things correspond, they function the same way. So when we start to think about some of the interesting facts about food, that actually can give us some insight into the way doctrine operates in our life, because it's just like food. So I mentioned this when I was advertising this class, that we tend to talk this way anyway, this correspondential way of talking. It gets into our everyday speech. We talk about being fed or nourished by ideas. We talk about chewing on an idea. We talk about don't bite off more than you can chew, which might refer to lots of different things, but it can also refer to the ways that we think about things. An idea might be hard to swallow. We use the word ruminate, which means both think deeply about things, but it also is referring to, the ways that cows ruminate on their food and chew their cud. We talk about an idea simmering on the back burner of our mind. We talk about breaking things up so that it becomes more digestible or more eatable. We talk about, let me boil that down for you, meaning simplify it or get it sort of separated. Or we talk about regurgitating an idea. You just regurgitated that idea. That wasn't a new idea. You're just regurgitating what you heard somebody else say. We use this language all the time because this correspondential way of talking has lasted from the ancient church. And here's some specifics of where that comes up. To boil in water denotes to reduce truths into doctrine and thus prepare them for the use of life. So we often use that to boil something down. There's this comparison with ideas being like spiritual breast milk that feed a baby. There's this interesting passage that talks about preachers regurgitating ideas. There's a fascinating one that talks about how people who take in many teachings from the word, yet do not live by those things, could be compared to gluttons who stuff food in chunks into their mouths. And then it goes on to talk about how, and they don't digest it because digesting it would be like putting it into use. But we can fall prey to that of I just want to take it all in, but not use it. And that's like being a glutton. It talks about our memory being like a ruminating stomach. Talks about truths tasting good. So this comes up all over the place in the Third Testament. Here's one of the examples of where it comes up a lot, because the Lord is our shepherd. And so we are compared to this flock being led by the Lord. And so pasture, the Lord leading us to pasture, is an image of the spiritual food that the Lord gives us. Pasture, in an inner sense, is what sustains spiritual life. In particular, it is truth in the form of knowledge, which our soul hungers for the way our body hungers for food. Such truth provides nourishment. So grazing in a pasture means being taught. The human longing for knowledge makes it very plain that knowledge and truth sustain the human soul. So does the correspondence of food with knowledge. This can be seen from the symbolism of pasturing a flock as teaching people in the church, especially teaching them doctrine. One who pastures a flock, a shepherd, means one who teaches. So there's a comparison. Oh, I forgot to check, by the way, people online, are you able to hear all right? Good. I see thumbs up. Good. This idea of the Lord feeding us comes up in this wonderful image of the feeding of the 5,000. Sometimes in the Third Testament, it talks about this story, the breaking of bread and the multiplication of that as being an image for lots of different things. And it could be that idea of love being multiplied. But there's this fascinating passage here that talks about it in this context, in the spiritual context. Since the state of ignorance of truth in which the Gentiles have been is signified by a wilderness, and the desire for truth by hunger, and instruction by the Lord by feeding, it came to pass that the Lord did this miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. So on that level, the spiritual level, that represents this instruction. There are a number of stories. I want to go through a couple of different stories in the Word that illustrate this idea. There's this story of Jacob giving Esau, his brother Esau, stew or soup. And I love this. It talks about how the soup symbolizes a jumble of doctrines. I love that image. Soup is a confused mass of doctrines. Cooking soup means jumbling them together. And later on, it talks about a disordered hodgepodge, a kind of chaos. And that can be how we experience things sometimes. And this is, not to put down soup or stew, because those are wonderful things. But sometimes in our mind, doctrines can be in this sort of jumbled mess. And it can be like a soup or a stew where you never know maybe what you're going to get on the spoon because it's just sort of a mess of things. So there's that imagery there. Here's another one. This is from a couple chapters later, Jacob giving his father Isaac some food. And it talks about this fascinating part of this analogy or this symbolism. Talking about food, some of food serves as a solvent, the food that we eat. Let me go back up. Not all the food that we swallow becomes part of our life. Some of it serves as a solvent for digesting the food, some for modifying it, some for breaking it down, and some for introducing it into the blood vessels. And then it goes on to talk about how this is just like the way we incorporate truth. Not all the information it brings in is suited to becoming part of a good life. Some of it serves as a means for digesting and modifying the rest, so to speak, some for breaking it down and introducing it. So we take in a lot of information in life, and not all of it is going to be truly nutritious, truly nourishing. But sometimes the little bits that go along with the more nutritious parts are a part of how we incorporate it. And I love that it talks about that there. We'll come back to that idea later. Here's another one. This is from the story of Elisha. Tom preached about this a little while ago. And this soup or this stew that had these gourds in it, and something was wrong with the gourds. And they said, there's death in the pot. It was poisonous. And Elisha did this miracle of throwing some flour in, and it healed it. And so it symbolizes, the soup symbolizes a mess of facts randomly thrown together. Meal or flour symbolizes truth that develops out of goodness. So sometimes we have these times where we've got all this information in our mind, and sometimes it might even feel like it's not just useless, but hurting us in some way. But as soon as we get some idea that is truly coming from goodness, it can start to make sense of the whole thing. And that's kind of what this story is about. Interestingly, manna, which is, I think, a lot of the times it represents love and goodness. It's bread from heaven. But in some contexts, it actually represents truth as well. Manna symbolizes divine truth, and it refers to the Lord being the bread of life. Often we think of that as a symbol for the Lord's love, but it can also represent the Lord's divine truth come down to earth, which is what the Lord was. The Lord took on that form. John the Baptist had interesting food that he ate, and it talks about how the clothes that he wore and the food that he ate was a symbol for the nature of the word, especially the external sense, the literal sense of the word. So it says food means spiritual nourishment derived from cognitions or knowledge of truth and good obtained from the word. Locusts, one of the things he ate, means the lowest or most general truths, like these bugs on the ground. And field honey or wild honey is the pleasantness of those. And so it talks about the nature of the literal sense of the word being a little bit like locusts and honey. It's this sort of low natural truth, but it has a kind of sweetness to it, like honey. And then there's this sort of more obvious symbolism, correspondence of the word being, or truth being like food in the story in Ezekiel, but also in Revelation of someone being told, here, eat this scroll, eat this little book. And then they do. And it's sweet in the mouth, but it's bitter in the stomach. And it's talking about how sometimes the nature of truth is that at first it's appealing, especially when we're not necessarily applying it to ourselves. That's so fascinating. I love that. That's great. But then it sort of hits and we go, oh, I have to repent? What? And in the belly, it's sort of like, then it becomes a little bit bitter. And that's the way the word can be sometimes. So I've already been leaning this way, but I've been talking about doctrine as symbolized by food, but I wanted to get to this point of saying that the word itself is also symbolized by food. And we hear this, the Lord said this in Matthew, humanity shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Angels and spirits sustain their life not with the kind of food the world offers, but with every word that issues from the Lord's mouth. So the entirety of heaven and the entire world of spirits live on everything that comes out of the Lord's mouth, and every individual there receives life from the same source. Indeed, this applies not only to heaven and the world of spirits, but to the entire human race as well. If angels, spirits, or people on earth were to be deprived of this food, they would die instantly. So the word itself is also described sometimes as food. I was so happy to find this graphic. I was just searching online. I think I just typed in doctrine as spiritual food into Google Images, and this came up, and it was like, that's perfect. It's exactly what I want. So I love that. Here's some other ones. Doctrine of the Lord 27. Food means everything true and good in the teaching drawn from the word, and therefore from the Lord. This is also the meaning of the manna and of the bread that comes down from heaven. Every single human being whose soul desires it has the capability to see the truths of the word in light. All animals know just by seeing it what food will keep them alive. So there's that comparison between the word and food again. The meaning the word has in heaven is as different from the meaning it has in the world or in the letter as heavenly food and drink are from earthly food and drink. And here's an interesting one from True Christianity. It's talking about the process of eating food and extracting nutrients from it. The spiritual angel draws out and extracts spiritual things from the word's literal meaning. And a heavenly angel draws out and extracts heavenly things because these things agree with their nature and are compatible with it. And it goes on to compare this to eating food. In the animal kingdom, when food has become chyle, blood vessels draw out and extract their blood from it. And it goes on to talk about other examples, but it's an interesting idea, this idea of sort of taking in the word, taking in the truths of the word, but then there's a process of kind of extracting what is truly nutritious out of that. And angels go through that process. And then we have this wonderful image of the word as spiritual food in the Lord in the manger. The manger is a place where horses go to eat. And so it's this right there in the Christmas story is this idea of the Lord came into the world as the word became flesh, and there it is in a manger being symbolized by this kind of spiritual food. So a lot of what I'm doing is sort of establishing a thing here. We've talked about how, first of all, food and drink have this symbolism, but we're talking on the spiritual level of food and drink both together as truth or doctrine, and then took it into this idea that the word itself can be like food. So now I want to talk about the ways that we interact with food. And there's often kind of a literal sense and an internal sense to food. And we'll get into that. But first of all, let's talk about that with the word itself. So the word has this feature to it that we know from the Third Testament, that there's parts of the word that are like the hands and face of a person, where the inner meaning just shines right out. And then there are parts of the word that are clothed, where the inner meaning is behind something. You sort of have to get through the clothing to get to what the inner meaning is. Literal meaning of the word is like a clothed person whose hands and face are bare. So there are parts of the word, where the Lord says, love your neighbor. That's like a face or a hand passage. It's very clear, right on the surface. You don't even really have to get into the internal sense of what does love your neighbor mean. It's right there. But then you get into passages like, and there was death in the pot. What does that mean? That's more of a clothed story, a clothed passage, because you have to get into the internal sense of it to find out, how is that nourishing to my life? So the word is like this. It has these parts that are clear and we see them, but then also clothed. Some of the truths in the word's literal meaning are apparent truths rather than naked truths. They're like similes or comparisons taken from earthly situations, which are therefore accommodated and adapted to the grasp of people who are simple or young. Nevertheless, because they are correspondences, they are still vessels and dwelling places for genuine truth. They are vessels that contain genuine truth, the way a crystal goblet contains fine wine or a silver plate holds palatable food. And what I'm kind of leading up to is, you could say, in addition to that, or the way food has an external part and an internal part. And that external part is like the clothing, and the internal part is the nourishing part. So let's get right into that. The literal sense of the word is kind of like a covering or a peel. And here's another interesting concept that I've always been fascinated by in the Third Testament, the way that angels understand what we think of as the literal sense of the word. Angels know nothing whatever of the literal contents of the word. I always find that so striking. They don't know anything about the literal sense of the word, or the most obvious meaning of even one word, still less the names of different lands, cities, rivers, and people that come up so frequently in the narrative and prophetic parts. All they picture are the things these words and names symbolize. In some, they see spiritual and heavenly realities in the word, completely separate from the words and names. So there's another passage that talks about how if you were to ask an angel, do you know who Abraham and Isaac and Jacob are? The angel would probably say no. But if you were to ask them, do you know what love is? Do you know what truth is? They would go, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about now. But for them, that literal sense has sort of fallen away. They don't dwell on that part of the word anymore because it doesn't have any connection to their life. It has to do with things of this world, people, lands, that kind of thing. So I like this image of, and there's one passage that, later on it says that it sort of falls away. This external sense or literal sense kind of falls away. I have this picture of, taking the peel off of corn. And I kind of think of some of our interaction with the word being a little bit like that. Sometimes you have to peel back the literal sense and let it go before we get to that internal sense.
We want people who have been ministers their whole life, and they're going to be in the other world and forget all about it.
But, right. And so, yeah, and I've wondered about that too. All this effort I've put into learning all these facts about the word, but that's going to carry over somehow. It's going to translate somehow. It's the same with any other profession, really, that all the facts we learn about how we do something in this world, it's not going to necessarily matter in the spiritual world, but the way that we are being useful, that will translate. And it might look a little different, but the heart of it will be the same. Like the words of human language, the names of people, countries, and cities in the word vanish at the very first threshold of their upward path. Names are some of these earthly, bodily, material things that the soul gradually sheds as it enters the next life, and sheds completely if it goes to heaven. Angels do not hold on to the slightest mental image of people in the word, so they do not retain the least idea of their names. What Abram is, what Isaac and Jacob are, they no longer know. It is the qualities represented and symbolized by figures in the word that form an angel's picture. Names and words are like chaff or scales that drop off when the ideas enter heaven. So like this, the chaff and the wheat, or like the husk of the corn. There are all sorts of ways we can think about this in connection with food.
And heaven being within that themselves.
Right. This is something not just that angels engage in, but that we can begin to engage in this process of, we're still going to need to interact with the literal sense of the word because it's that container. Just like if you want a piece of corn, you're going to have to go find it in that husk. But it's that process of peeling back the layers. Tom.
Yeah, I mean, given what that says, even though it says that they fall away and drop off as the ideas enter heaven, nevertheless, when we're learning and becoming spiritual, we have to have it.
Right.
We can't just be given the pulp.
Right. And we're going to get into talking about why that is. Why is it that has to be the way it is? Oops, sorry. Here's another one. Those who possess authentic teachings of truth that are derived from the word and who receive enlightenment when they read the word do not cling to the actual statements made there in accordance with appearances and ordinary human perception, because they know that if the appearances are opened out and, so to speak, peeled away, truth is laid bare there. It should be remembered that the inward sense of the word contains the authentic teachings of the church. And this one from True Christianity. Afterward, the heavenly light I had seen above the opening came back. It came down bit by bit and filled the inner reaches of my mind, enlightening my ideas of the Trinity and the unity of God. And then I saw my former merely earthly ideas being separated out, just as husks are shaken off wheat, tossed in a winnowing basket. I saw my old notions carried off as if by a wind to the north of heaven and scattered. So this is a process that we can go through in the way that we interact with the Lord's divine truth. Here's another one. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but it starts by talking about the idea that interior things and exterior things are connected. They have a connection. And it's a little bit like the way fruit has a peel and a core. Some idea of this may be conveyed by considering fruits such as lemons, apples, and the like. Their most external parts are their surrounding skins, and their interiors are the surrounding flesh or pulp. And then it goes on to talk about how they're connected and it's important that they're connected. It wouldn't survive if there was no connection between the two. But when those interiors and exteriors are first formed, they are very closely connected, but in the course of time, they are separated. So you can think about the need for an orange to grow the way it does, where the inside and the outside are just so connected, and you couldn't have one without the other. But there comes a time when, if we're going to partake of that orange, we have to peel them away. We have to disconnect that external and that from that internal, or the literal from the internal. The state of the church before the Lord's coming is like the skin from a piece of fruit, like an orange, an apple, a pear, or a grape, and like the taste of that skin. The taste of the church after his coming is like the flesh of those types of fruit, and like the taste of that flesh. I love the way that those images appear there in the Third Testament. Right, right. Not just like a historical coming, but the way that the Lord comes to us. I think that's a big part of this whole thing, is when the Lord's coming happens in us, is when we're engaging in this sort of peeling back of layers. So I started thinking about this concept when I was working for the General Church. And I started to realize that some of my colleagues might disagree with me on this, because I was thinking that this could also apply to the Third Testament. And that they're just like in the Old and New Testament, how there are parts, there's these stories where you look at the story itself and go, what does this have to do with anything? But then you start to peel it back and go, oh, this is good. This is really good. But I had to peel it off first. And the same thing, we think in the Lord's New Church happens in the Third Testament, that there are parts of the Third Testament where it's those names and that history and those details that are about this world. And there are times when that needs to be peeled back a little bit to get to the nutritious part. I think that this is going to be a feature of any form of divine revelation, that there's going to be a literal sense and an internal sense, and that to varying degrees, that literal sense is like a peel. And I have this, I talked about this briefly in a previous doctrinal class. There are differences in food. So like a fruit that has a peel, but we can usually just eat the peel along with the flesh inside. And there are parts of the word, and maybe even the majority of the Third Testament might be sort of like an apple, where we eat the literal sense because it's just as nutritious as the inside. But there might be other parts that are more like a banana where, no, I got to peel that back. And it's not too hard to peel that back. But I have to peel that back and let go of the historical nature of this and get to the spiritual part of it. But there might be other parts of any of the testaments that are more like a coconut, where it's like, this is taking some work to get to the nourishing part. And it's hard work, and I might need some tools actually to get to the inner part. And I think that you more often find that in the Old Testament, but I think you find that also in the Third Testament and the New Testament as well. Let's brainstorm some things. Can you think of some foods that are like this, that you have to remove something in order to eat?
I brought some rambutan.
Yes, Nancy has a visual aid here.
Should I read it out?
Yeah, maybe if you bring it up. There are foods that we have to take the peel off, not like an apple, where we have to remove something in order to get anything nourishing out of it. And what was it that you called this? Rambutan. Maybe you can sort of hold it up towards the camera too.
It's a relative of the leaf. But they have the long whiskers which make them the literal sense, and the
Len,
right
can
time
you-
you need a knife to open them up really cheap and just pop them.
That is tasty, I had that.
It is very tasty.
pineapples,
You hold it up, where's the camera?
Camera's back there, if you can hold it up.
another fruit would be pineapple, durian,
Yeah.
southeastern, got spike, has a spiky.
Yeah,
Outside to it.
yep.
Bite into that.
So people online, that's, say the word again, Nancy? Rambutan. I've never heard of this kind of food, but it's so cool because it's this sort of example of things like that. And in some cases, this kind of food, it's almost scary on the outside until you get to the inside. And that's the way the word can be sometimes. It can be almost scary, like, whoa, I don't even want to get anywhere near that. But then you find out that, oh, if you peel back the layer, there's something very nutritious on the inside. Yeah, Tom.
Not really fully appreciated till we moved to Maryland, we were there for 5 years. How much effort people will put into eating a crab. You know,
Yeah.
around these tables and this
Yeah.
tablecloths, and they're just working so hard. And other shellfish, you know, like lobster and stuff, but they're just working to get this little, you know, but they just keep at it, and it's wonderful food, but boy, it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
And if you've ever slaughtered an animal, that's a lot of work.
Yeah. So there's a lot of work that can be involved in this kind of food. And that's part of the work that we do in the church and in church communities. Here I've got some examples. Some people mentioned the pineapple. There's jackfruit. Another one I was thinking of.
Yeah.
Pistachios. I love pistachios. And sometimes they're a pain in the neck to try to get that juicy part out. Like, okay, there it finally comes out. We talk about that. Boy, this is a tough nut to crack. Sometimes we refer to some passage in the word like that. This is a tough nut to crack. And so walnuts, yep. Here's some other examples. The wheat and the chaff. I've got this cassava or yucca. I put this one up here because it said that in this case, the skin or the peel is actually toxic. Like you really have to get rid of it or it's dangerous. And it makes me think about the ways that there are some passages in the word that if you just take it purely literally, it can become toxic. Spirits of Jupiter, but I'm thinking more like the passages in the word where the Lord is saying, go kill those people.
Or women can't become judges.
Or women can't become judges, or all of these things that are tied to a time period. What's that? Money is evil. There are these things. And I think especially of like the violence in the literal sense of the word, that if we just eat that, it is toxic, like this the skin of the yucca.
Cashews are like that too.
Cashews. Here's some other ones people mentioned. Oyster or clams or fish. Eggs deal with this very commonly. You got to take that shell off before you can get to the egg. Sometimes the shell can even be pokey and, you know, get under your fingernail and it hurts. And think about things about the literal sense of the word that are kind of like all of these things. Either they're scary or they're really hard or they're sharp, pointy, even dangerous. The literal sense of the word can be like that. And the problem is, you know, sometimes people will look at the word and go, well, what's the point? And it's a little bit like looking at a clam or an oyster and going, what's the point? I'm not going to eat that. And we can use this analogy of thinking about food as a useful way of thinking about the word. That, well, yes, there's a point. There's something nutritious inside if you're willing to stick with us at this table and get through that outer part. All right, let's brainstorm some more. What are some foods where the outer layer may or may not be removed? This is an interesting category. Apples, sometimes people peel apples, sometimes they don't. Cucumbers, sometimes people peel cucumbers, sometimes they don't. Tomatoes. One that I think about a lot is potatoes. I spend a lot of time in my cooking peeling potatoes, but then we sometimes make potatoes where we eat the peel. It's fascinating. Fish,
Sashimi, I eat raw fish, sushi.
and that has like the outer layer still on it or something?
Well, yeah, but you don't have to, you can like eat it without having, you usually will clean fish, but there are like, examples of, like, of things that you can just grab and pull apart and eat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Here's some other examples I thought of. Kiwi. You can eat the skin of a kiwi. Some people don't like the fuzziness, so they peel it off, but you can eat it. Same thing with peaches, apricots, grapes. Sometimes people peel grapes. Sometimes. Yeah, there we go. For babies. Or babies are Roman senators. Yes. But that's a may or may not. Potatoes. I think about things like the crust of bread. You know, once again, babies or kids, sometimes they want the crust off. And we're sitting there going, I like the crust. And that's a little bit like the way we interact with the word, where some people would say, I really like the literal sense of that story. And somebody else might go, I don't. I like what it means, but I don't like the literal sense of it. And it's a little bit of that taste. We all have different tastes when it comes to the peel or the external layer. Yeah, Tom.
There might be a beautiful hand and face passage. You just eat it, it's buried out in the wilderness.
Yeah.
You don't peel the little bear. You
Right.
eat the bear.
Yeah.
And it's wonderful. But then you realize there's a celestial, there's a highest sense of everything. We're talking about the word. We want to really get down with it. Then you crush it and make wine.
Yeah.
So-
Yeah. We're going to get in a little bit later, get into the cooking element of things, the way that we change food and how we interact with it. Carrots is another one. My mom used to grow carrots in the garden, and I loved just going and pulling a carrot straight out of the ground, just washing it and eating it. But a lot of the time I peel carrots, you know, different ways of doing it. Okay, here's another category, outer layer not removed. Tom already mentioned one. Berries is a great example of foods in which the outer layer is not removed. Star fruit. What are some other? Apples is another one. Pears, grapes, strawberry, a lot of berries, a lot of fruits. Yeah. I was thinking about vegetables too, like lettuce, interesting things like green peppers, where it's actually the outer layer that we eat. And we'll get into that too. Mushrooms, snow peas, celery is something that you sort of cut parts of it off, but you eat the skin of it as well. Right, you don't have to. These are things you can just eat.
Some species of eat whole.
Yeah.
Like smokies, we eat including the pod.
Yeah, I love that example.
We eat the whole thing,
The-
but navy beans and black beans, they all grew in a pod, didn't eat the pod.
Yeah. And it's like in this case, the literal sense is my favorite part. It's the crunchy part, like a snow pea. Yeah, Gary.
Beans, the lower left quarter. What kind of beans?
Those are snow peas. That was another thing my mom used to grow in her garden, and we would just go and pick them
Yes.
and eat them. Just the whole thing like that. So great. Yeah. We'll get into the idea of different tastes in a minute too. Bread, I mentioned bread before, but lots of people love the crust of bread. You know, it's the crunchy, I like that part. Tomato, berries, there's all sorts of things we eat that we just eat all of it. And that's like those hands and face passages, the literal sense and the internal sense, it's almost like they're one and the same. And we just take it all in. And there's a lot of food like that. There are a lot of parts of sacred scripture like that. Interestingly, there's also a category of food in which we remove the center. Can you think of foods like that? Avocado, cherries, some
Pineapples,
grapes, pineapples. What was that?
any stone fruit.
Any stone fruit, something that has a pit in it, yeah. I was thinking also about the green pepper. When I cut up a green pepper, it's the center part, the seeds that I let go of, and we use the outside. I was thinking about meat that has a bone in it. We take the bone out. And one of the ways I was thinking about this, if we think about this idea of what is outer and what is inner, I think that there are parts of the word that are so far beyond our comprehension. They're ineffable. And it's almost like the pit of an avocado, where, yeah, that's not going to be nutritious for me. It's at the core, it's at the center, but only the highest angels could understand that. And there are parts of the word, I think, like that, where it says, yeah, mostly this is just the angels will understand this, and we have other things that work for us.
It's interesting, an almond is a stone fruit that you eat in the center because it corresponds to understandings of the interiors of the word.
Yeah, and this is what I love about this, is there's all these different kinds of foods that illustrate all these different ways that the Lord's truth comes into our life. And it's just so fascinating. So I started thinking about this concept because I've heard people use lots of different analogies for what the role of a minister is. And some of them I like more than others. And I was sort of trying to find what would be a good analogy for describing what I think of as my job. Some of the ones that I don't like are things like, oh, you're like a spiritual policeman. No, I don't like that analogy at all. I sort of like the librarian analogy. Like, you want to know where to find this? I can tell you where to find this. But what has really been sticking with me lately is the analogy of ministers being like spiritual chefs. And so I made a little graphic to illustrate that.
Oh, well.
Yeah. But so lately, with Tira being in school, in seminary, I've been doing a lot of the cooking at home. And so I've been thinking about this concept a lot and thinking through all the things I do almost every day to get a meal ready for our family. I do a lot of peeling and shelling, which is what we've been talking about, taking that outer layer off. And there's often a pile of the peels once I'm ready to actually start serving things to other people. And that's something that I do as part of my job as a minister. I will start to help people remove that peel. You know, here's this food, but I'm going to take a little bit of that peel off for you because some of that peel is maybe less nutritious. It's not going to nourish you the way that internal sense is. Also, I do a lot of washing and cleaning. I think that imagery of repentance as a part of my job, as a part of all of our jobs in engaging with the word, is a good thing. I do a lot of cutting into pieces. As a minister, I take a massive chunk of doctrine in a book and I literally cut and paste various passages and I assemble them in a different order sometimes. And that's the way a cook does things. You cut things into pieces and you serve it in a way that looks maybe different than what it looked like before when it was just raw doctrine. Makes it more digestible. I often spend a lot of time cutting out the bad parts of food, like the things that have gone rotten. And I was thinking about how this might connect to the idea that the literal sense of the word is going to continue to age the way it already has aged. And we see this especially in the Old Testament. There are parts of the Old Testament, the literal sense, that were very relevant to the ancient Israelites. But as time went on, that literal sense became less and less relevant, to the point where now sometimes that literal sense is, we don't want it at all because it's not referring to our spiritual life. And so it's almost like it has aged out. It has gone bad in the sense that you can't eat that part. You need to get rid of that part. And I think all sacred scripture is going to have that process of the literal sense will just be part of the time of natural world. So the Third Testament is a newer revelation. I think it will have less of those parts. But older scriptures, I think, will have more of those parts that are tied to a specific time period. And so they've aged. And we sometimes cut off the parts of food that have aged. Yeah.
I mean, I think the more specifics we forget in some passages about his examples from his life in that moment, they're already things we need to just sort of go, how could that look like today?
Yeah.
And so it's not that they've gone bad at all, it's just that we already can't just take them at that natural level at face value. We
Yeah.
already have to take the natural level and go, how will this be relevant?
Right. Going bad is not the best way to describe it, but I like the way you put it, that that's what's happening. Yeah.
Yeah, I think being a spiritual chef, plus being a gardener as a pastor, because
Yeah.
you can't just look at something because it's bad, but the bad stuff can be food for the plant, that you can eat for the next day.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe not the next day, maybe next season. That's very important to recognize. Yes.
Right.
So you want to be organic too. You just don't
Yeah.
want to put any from Lowe's or Home Depot.
Yeah, I think about that a lot too, because we have a compost pile and I think about, there's this huge pile of stuff that I've now cut off of this food. We're not going to eat that. We're going to eat this, but it's not useless. It's going to be useful in some way. And sometimes it's hard to see, how is this literal sense going to be useful? And maybe we can't always see it right away. Maybe it takes some time to see, oh, this is how it's going to be useful. Yeah.
Well, there's I mean, the literal sense is every jot and tittle is important. So really you can't cut off any of it, but you can look at it through the lens of the Third Testament and know you're not meant to count any person, place, time, or space. The word is a letter. You're looking at red dragons here, which don't really exist. The only thing that exists is the glory in the cloud, not the cloud. The cloud's necessary
Right.
for receiving it, and
Right.
each bit of that cloud is sacred. But without the glory, it's just a rotten corpse. So
Yeah.
it's an important thing. You're not really cutting it out. You're saying, let's look at that in a higher view without person, place, time, or space. Let's not look at the Lord causing the bear to eat the little children and
Right.
saying, oh, that's what we should do to how we should treat little children. But let's look at what the correspondence is, which are still the exterior sense. We're still
Yeah.
dealing in the literal sense with correspondences, but we're
Right.
trying to elevate our mind.
Right. And so like my job as a minister, I would still tell that story. And so it would be like the peel is still there. But I like this idea of, if you think about the whole process of how we live as being a part of what's going on inside of us. So I'm peeling these potatoes. I'm have this pile of potato peels. I'm serving this meal that doesn't include that, but those potato peels go into the compost and they help this new thing grow. And to think that all of that is happening inside of me. And so it's not about actually letting go of anything. It's just about how we interact with it, and where it fits in the proper order of things. So then we get things like mashing and grinding and crushing and tenderizing, which sounds pretty violent, but I think that there is a way in which part of my job and all of our jobs is to figure out how to soften things so that it's easier to take in. And we can do that with, when we find out what the internal sense of a passage is, that's part of that softening of that, what looked hard and nasty on the outside has now been softened by finding out what the internal sense is. As a minister, I do a lot of mixing and blending and combining. Here's a passage from this book, here's a passage from that book. I'm putting them right next to each other, even though they came from different books, like different pieces of food that grew in different parts of the world that now are on the same plate. Do a lot of adding of water when I'm cooking. adding truth, things like rice and noodles, do a lot of adding heat. A lot of what I do when I cook is adding heat, adding love. I think that's a key part of all of this, is to really make the word digestible. We need that added love that comes from us, that comes from our experience. And ultimately it comes from the Lord, but it comes through us when we can see how, oh, this applies in my life this way. And it has changed me in such an important way. And it helps me love people. And that's like adding that heat to what could be seen as a cold chunk of doctrine. But now it's brought to life, as it were, by this heat. And then seasoning, spicing things up. When I preach, I often like to throw in interesting little tidbits to make sure you're awake, or like wear an apron. As you know, I didn't have to wear this apron tonight, but it was kind of fun to wear this apron. It's like adding a little spice to something that you don't need it to be nutritious, but it makes it more interesting.
Well, the love bit, there's one of my favorite passages. It says, without delight in the Lord, there can be no enlightenment. And so you're just always going to be in the letter, no matter how deep you seem to look. Without loving the Lord, without delighting in the Lord, there can be no lifting into another level of the word.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. And here's some other concepts that have come to mind when thinking about this correspondence. The idea that we want, you know, as a chef, I want my food to be healthy and tasty. And I think that ministers try to do that. I think we can all try to do that in thinking about what is both nourishing and interesting in how we engage with the word and with each other. I like to think about the idea that as a minister, I've got my own style, like my own recipes. As a church, it's like we have got our own menu that might be different from another church, and they might be serving the same basic foods, but it's a different way of serving food. And some people might like that kind of food better than this kind of food, even though at its basic elements, it's the same food. But you know, some people like Mexican or Chinese or whatever it is, different styles. And those are, I think, like to think those as being like the different churches around the world, different religions, still serving goodness and truth, but in different ways that appeal to different people. I like this phrase, not forcing something down someone's throat. You know, we use that phrase in terms of how we want to try to spread the church. And that's tying into this analogy once again. I started thinking about food allergies. And this is an interesting one because you end up with a situation where, let's say somebody has an allergy to gluten. You know, I can't do gluten. Another person is fine with gluten. What is going on there about that? And sometimes I think that might refer to things like there are some people who have maybe experienced abuse at the hands of a man. And so the language in the word that, in the literal sense, that often puts men on a pedestal, patriarchal society, the Lord as a man. Sometimes you can have an allergy to that. And there are people that might need to think of the divine feminine because they've got this allergy to an exclusive way of thinking of God as just masculine. And it's like this sensitivity because of various things. And I think there's lots of different examples of that where we like different parts of the word and we maybe we find other parts of it not as appealing because we have some sort of sensitivity to whatever that is, violence or whatever it might be. We've got a sensitivity to it. And the nice thing is the word is so all pervasive and all encompassing that there's something for everyone. Kind of like even people with sensitivities and allergies can find something to eat, even if they have to cut out other parts. But I think that that applies to this as well, this idea of having food allergies. And then I've sort of been hinting at it, but I've been talking about this from my perspective as a minister, but it's really just like there are professional chefs and then people cook at home. This is a process that we all go through. So whether it's me preparing a sermon for church as my job, or whether it's any one of us engaging with the word and digesting it and then trying to talk to somebody else about it from our perspective. It's like being a home cook. You know, here's what I love about this story, and sort of serve that on a plate. It applies to all of us. This way of thinking about things applies to all of us. Here's a passage about having different tastes. To describe the food of people who are to be reborn, before we can be reborn, we have to be equipped with everything instrumental to rebirth. Good, joyful feelings serve the needs of our will, while truth from the Lord's word, along with support and confirmation from other sources, serves our intellectual needs. Till we receive this preparation, we cannot be regenerated. Those supplies are our food. That is why we cannot be regenerated before we reach adulthood. But we each have foods particularly appropriate to us that seem to be all our own, and the Lord provides us with them prior to our rebirth. So I love that idea that everybody has their own foods that work best for them. And you can find all of that in sacred scripture. But the Lord works carefully with each of us to make sure that he's guiding us towards this is the part of sacred scripture that's going to serve you. And sometimes that can be a hard process, kind of like when we have to try different diets before we figure out, oh, this is what I need to avoid, and this is the food that really works for me. I think the same process happens with divine revelation, that we sometimes have to try different things. But the Lord is guiding us towards this is what you need. This is what will be nourishing to you. And it might be different from what somebody else needs. So I want to sort of wrap things up with some questions. First of all, why is the word like this? Why is it that there is this literal sense and internal sense? Why is it that we can't just have the internal sense all the time? We've already sort of gotten into this a little bit, but let's talk a little bit more about that. Why is this necessary for there to be both a literal sense and an internal sense to the word? Tom?
One is attraction. It's like, you know, if I describe apple juice to somebody, it'd be very hard to describe. It's a liquid that tastes like what? How do you just
Yeah,
show? Look at this.
Like that.
Ooh, that looks good.
yeah,
I'm attracted to the literal sense.
yeah.
And then I find out, wow, it's nothing to do with that red thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I can think of stories in the word that I still love, just the story itself. And that came first before I was even old enough to understand why this is an important story. But I just liked the story. Yeah, that's part of it. Yep.
I think there are parts of the word that tell us that there's more there. For instance, Ezekiel's wheel, or Revelation, or the dwarves on the moon. They tell us to look higher,
Mm-hmm.
and that's one of the important parts of life, is always look up the ladder.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think that that's one of the useful things about exploring this analogy is when we think about all the different ways that we engage with food, it's just become kind of second nature to us to recognize that, oh, I have to get beyond the shell, or I have to get beyond the peel. And I know that. We all know that. That's just part of how we live. But that's not always as obvious with things with the word. That it's useful to think about it this way because it reminds us to look beyond, to look higher, to look deeper, which is an important part of life in general. You know, don't judge a book by its cover. Don't judge a person just by their externals. And it applies to everything, to Revelation as well.
there's some flexibility in that two people hearing the story might get two different messages from God, or
Yeah.
the 20-year-old me hearing that story might get a different message than the 40-year-old.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's really important too. And very often those, sometimes not, sometimes the shells are hard, but sometimes the peels have sort of a flexibility to them. Yeah, CT.
I remember when I was little, I loved the story of Moses. You didn't have to explain anything. I just love the story of it. I'm just like, go to sleep and seeing him in my head, seeing all those, it just, I don't know what it means, but I just love seeing that somebody I've never met
Yeah,
and actually have that adventure. That's my hero. And until now, if somebody asks who you want to meet, I'll say Moses.
nice,
Without, in fact, if he is to me.
nice. Yeah, it's pretty great. Yeah.
There's also satisfaction of whacking the coconut. And
Yes. Yes, and this is one that I can relate to a lot. When I was growing up, my grandma, my dad's mom, made these flashcards, and they were correspondences flashcards. And they talked about the different correspondences. Like, you know, on one side would be a sword, and on the other side it would say truth. And I just loved this. I loved this idea that the word is coded, like it's a secret code that you can crack. Like I just loved that idea. And I think you're right. Sometimes people will like the process of you have to sit down at the table and you have to take the hammer and whatever it is to open up the food. That's part of the enjoyment of it. And that can be the case with the word as well.
You ask if anybody online has any comments?
Yeah, any comments from people online? Yeah, Shelley.
Sorry. I think that some parts of the word are more edible than others because then not everybody is at the same, like learns everything at the same time. So there's something that will appeal, no pun intended, to everybody. And as we spiritually evolve, more is revealed as well. So you can be not really spiritually enlightened and still open the Bible and get a lot out of it, just on the literal sense. Obviously, if you're more introspective and you're studying, you can go a lot deeper and see more.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
kind of how I think about it.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Tira.
I think too, this is the same idea of looking at it from the other end of the history. If it wasn't as old as it was, then the people then would have had to wait for sacred scripture. And that wouldn't be fair. But it also meant that it was written at a time in a place. And so it must have a depth to that meaning, or it would cease to be meaningful for us. So anyway.
Yeah. Yep. I think time is a big part of all of this. The idea that divine revelation is given by the Lord from this timeless place with these timeless truths, but then it's dropped into the world of time that we live in. And so it will have to adapt. It will have to be adapted to the fact that it is now in time. So it's written for a certain people at a certain time, and then time marches on. And then another revelation written for a certain people at a certain time, and time marches on. And that's going to affect the way we engage with that sense. It's not necessarily food, but I like to think about the image of a tree. When a tree is just starting to grow, it's this tender little sapling. But over time, it starts to put on layers that become harder and harder and harder. And it eventually has this bark. And that is a process that takes time. And that's sort of like the process that sacred scripture goes through, where when it's first given, it's this tender little shoot that is applicable in the literal sense to the people it was given to. But over time, it then forms this shell, because now the literal sense applies just to those people, or mostly to those people. and then there's something at the core. A tree isn't really the best analogy there because we don't eat trees, but I think about it sort of like that. And I think another piece of that, the time element, but also the idea of protection. A lot of passages you'll look up will talk about the reason something is a certain way in the literal sense and how it's different from the internal sense has to do with protection. There's this image of these cherubim that are the protectors of the word. And the cherubim are like this literal sense that is a little weird and scary, but it's preserving something at the core. And I think the word is like that. The literal sense of the word is like this protection for the timeless truths that are at the core. And it's the same thing with food. You know, if you were to just have an orange without the peel, it would not survive. It would not last long enough for us to eat it without that protective peel on the outside. Not all food is like that, but some foods, they need that protective peel to get to the part where it's now nourishing for us. So I think that's a piece of it too.
Pawpaws you can't sell in the store. Because they're too tender and they just turn into this bruised, horrible, rotten banana thing, but the largest fruit in the US. Is named the US, and no one knows what they taste like because they can't sell them.
Wow.
Can't survive the process of becoming.
We're
You
growing
have to-
pawpaws on the property, so we soon will be able to.
You have to just eat them right off the
Right
whatever.
off the tree.
Wow.
I miss people picking up pawpaws and putting them in their pocket.
No, you can't put a pawpaw in your pocket. It didn't smash all over the place.
Well,
Yeah,
that's
Robert.
Part of the food and spiritual truths of why things are, some things taste better than others. Some things are boring to read and some things are more exciting, like an adventure
Yeah.
story is more exciting than a list of genealogy names of
Right.
son of, son of, son of, son of. So that's another part of why some things are more edible.
Yeah, and there's a reason that the genealogies are there, and that's maybe even an example of sort of like the pit of the avocado, where all those names, we don't even necessarily know what all those names mean, but the angels know what each of those names mean, and they mean something very specific, but we don't. And it's almost like this core that we can't, it's not really digestible for us, but it's part of it. Yeah. Oh,
First.
Don.
The light of the first day is to see that the good and true is something higher. And that's the very beginning of the Arcana and of the Old Testament. And the only way to have the Lord come to you and enlightenment is to always see that the good and true is something higher than what you're thinking. That it's not from your rational, but that it's something from the Lord. It has to be living in you. And every one of the churches talked about, we have to go through those states, the Adamic state, the Israelite, every one of those are states. That so when we come to an understanding of what that is, the word becomes so much more alive.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like to think about the way that what the food that we've been talking about is it's this form of life that, you know, in the pawpaw case, it's like you have to eat it almost while it's still alive. And there's this life to the word. And yeah, I saw another hand, Julie.
Yeah, I was just thinking, since I speak with people who don't have anything about the writings, but it's amazing that we can go through stories and each time we find something else new. And I don't have a huge number. I always plan to make more, but it's amazing new things that you find when you go back to the same place we were at maybe a few months ago.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm the sort of person that tends to like the foods that I like, and I'm not super adventurous. And my lovely wife is much more adventurous with food, and she introduces me to new foods, which I'm very grateful for. And I feel like it's the same sort of thing with the word sometimes, that sometimes there might be a story that never really did much for us. And then somebody introduces us to a new way of looking at it. And suddenly, oh, that's now my favorite story. Like, wow, this is now my favorite food, and have never had it before. All right. So yeah, I just wanted to wrap up by bringing us back to we have been talking, this whole class has been on this blue level of seeing food as doctrine or truth or the word. And I want to just remind us as we leave that we are always encouraged to go back up to that celestial level and to remember that it's sort of like being here tonight. This is like hopefully having a nice meal together, maybe chewing on some ideas that taste good. But ultimately, the word is for us to digest and then give us energy to live the life of love. And so that sort of takes us back up to that celestial level where food is a symbol for the action of love, the life of love. So I just wanted to kind of end with that idea. And thank you all for coming. Yes. Let me just stop the share.
Going to a class like this, it's like going to a restaurant. We're gonna come and have it. We're gonna enjoy what you have on the menu for us to enjoy. But our own application is like, let's see, what am I interested in, and get things from the store and put it together.
Yeah.
But there's a difference. And sometimes our attraction to food is because we've tasted something at a restaurant. We want to get that taste. There's a certain taste we're after. I don't care how they make it. I don't want to look at the ingredients per se. I want that taste. And I'll go get it.
Yeah.
I'm gonna get mussel curry or whatever it's called, because it tastes a certain way. I don't know how they make it. So, but if I want to make it, then I have to study how to do that and so on. But I just love the different ways the word itself is presented. And you'll be talking to a person, Dawn is telling me things, and I'm like, well, I'm tasting things that I didn't ever taste that way before because of a different individual presenting it. That's a different experience than my attraction to that story.
Yeah. Yeah. And I started thinking about this in terms of my own job, and I really love this analogy. I love to think of myself as a spiritual chef, as my job. And I like to think that there are ways in which I can do the work of chopping and peeling that maybe not everybody wants to do, or the blending and combining, or knowing how this recipe works. And that I can just serve something to you that has already had some of that work being done. And I like that. I like to think of it as that's part of what I get to do as my job. But I also like to think that that's part of what we all get to do. We all have our different things that we like to do and we like the work of, and maybe like to do them so that other people don't have to do that work. And it's like being the chef and serving the meal.
I love the vision of the Lord on the beach cooking breakfast for the apostles.
Mm-hmm.
And then saying, feed my sheep, feed my sheep, feed my lambs, feed my sheep.
Yeah.
Telling us to be like the Lord, and also, provide for other people. But provide that love for other people. But I will tell you that it depends on how you cook, because in college I went through AA, BA, and masters, and I had to read Kindred to Love 4 different times for 4 different classes, and some ministers, I was just like, this is like light shining from my face, and I'm reading it with the teacher, and other ones I was shouting at the Lord, dashing it against my knee. How could you? Because it was presented in such a literal, and just reading it with that influence made me so angry. And then coming back again, this is the face of God, you know, and this is everything of life, of the conjunction of my will and my understanding. And of course, this is everything, and this is the word, the Lord himself, and, you know, the divine human of the Lord present with us. But if you're just looking at the letter, it's infuriating to the
Absolutely.
woman sometimes. So it's, it just depends, like, sometimes you know, someone cooks a fish and you're
Yeah.
and sometimes gives you a fish and you're like, oh my goodness, that's the best thing on earth.
Yeah, especially if somebody offers you a plate with a fish that has not been scaled.
Yeah.
And you're like, why didn't you remove the literal sense here?
Yeah, all the guts still in it and everything.
Especially because they're presenting it to you and saying, you must eat the whole thing.
Yeah, eyeballs and all.
And you can't cook it.
Right.
Well, you might notice we never did finish that work we were doing about the woman's idea of conjugal love, because somehow or other we never quite finished it.
Hmm. Oh, I thought it was still a work in progress.
Well, we haven't done anything with it.
I'm sorry.
I don't know, it's hard to do.
Yeah.
We were trying to get people with the different ideas of that work. It was mostly those of us who were trying to find different ways to actually think everything's okay. I read that a number of times. You know, I remember being so angry, putting the book down.
Hmm.
But I knew there was more to it than that. So
Yeah.
now I can't read very well, so there we are. I have to wait for the other side.
And that's part of, you know, if there's a takeaway tonight, my hope is one of the takeaways is in the same way that we have learned to look at a piece of food and go, I know I just need to take the shell off or the peel off or you know, crack this nut and there's something beautiful inside, wonderful inside. If we can take that attitude to the word, I think that can make some of those situations easier. Tara.
Same idea. That there are times that it's like, I know there's good food there. That's gonna work and I'm prepared to go for right now. So
Yeah.
I'm going to go to the part that is ready to eat. Easier to digest, because that's the.
Sometimes we eat Burger King,
Right, exactly. Eat
Yeah.
sometimes it's the easy fast food. And sometimes it's like, no, I'm ready for cooking the steamed pork buns myself.
Oh,
Actually, it's probably never gonna happen, but I at least watched how and then went, yup, this is always gonna be a restaurant experience.
Yeah.
That's another phrase, right? The low hanging fruit.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if you look at conjugal love as that, and the word never talks, and it says that the word is about the Lord's glorification and man's regeneration and nothing else. And if you're trying to use it as a marriage textbook, it doesn't work.
Well, it's also this thing that it is the divine human of the Lord, and the Lord is above gender. And as soon as you start genderizing the Lord, you've lost the top of the ladder. You have to constantly come back to the Lord as love itself. This is a love letter. This is the communication of divine love to my life to make me happy. And as soon as it's like, even the strict parts, like thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not, you know, or all the strict parts are there because if you live that way, you're not going to be happy. It's all about bringing bliss and joy and love to your life. And if you keep on going back there to know that this is the Lord in my life, and above gender. So it's talking about what Mom was saying. This is the good and truth in my life that are conjoined with the Lord.
And it's not something we experience in real life, but I think our experience of the word is that sometimes it starts out like a coconut And over time, it starts to become more like an apple, where it's easier to peel back the layer. And we don't experience that with food. Like food doesn't change that way, but I think our interaction with the word can, where at first it's really hard to get through. But after a while, it's much, much easier to get through.
Especially if you gain the right tools and learn the techniques.
Right, right.
I watch people open coconuts and they just fly through it, and you're like, that took training, skill,
Yeah.
practice.
All right, we are at 8:30. It's lovely to see you all. I hope you all have a wonderful night. Thanks for joining us online, everybody. Good night.